There was no sound in Cleopatra's chamber, only breath through veils of perfume and the thick, cloying silence of incense soaked in ritual. This was not a room for rest. It was a furnace where power was distilled nightly, drop by drop, into the folds of silk, the steep of oils, the fabric of skin. The door behind her would close with a whisper, sealing her off from the empire she ruled, locking her into a war that played out not on battlefields but in mirrors, in bathwater, and in the air itself. She had long since stopped bathing for comfort. Comfort was for the innocent. Her immersion in oils was a strategy, practiced and perfected. The oils were imported from lands as distant as Punt and Mesopotamia, as rare as loyalty in a royal court. Their procurement required diplomacy, secrecy, and blood. Each scent had a function: frankincense to embolden, myrrh to numb, blue lotus to seduce. She knew the chemical properties of each, but more importantly, she knew what they did to men, how scent altered judgment, how it clung to memory like a fever. If you've made it this far into the shadows of history, help this channel grow. Like the video, subscribe for more dark true stories, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps these buried truths alive. Nothing in that chamber was accidental. The alabaster jars, the basalt floor tiles, the candle smoke tinged with resin, each detail was calculated to overwhelm the senses. Her quarters were not a sanctuary, they were a trap. Visitors who entered them didn't leave unchanged. Soldiers, dignitaries, lovers, they walked in breathing one world and left unable to remember it. Cleopatra didn't shout to dominate. She inhaled quietly, exhaled slowly, and let the room devour them. But what no one saw, what no record fully captured, was what it cost her to be a queen in Egypt. A land rotting with Roman pressure and internal betrayal meant no mistakes, no cracks, no room for rest. So she turned her very flesh into policy. She embodied myth so thoroughly that even her solitude had structure. She did not lounge, she posed. She did not sleep, she meditated. She did not sweat, she exhaled intention. Each night the ritual began again. 2 attendants would bring the marble bowls, one of heated milk, the other of crushed hibiscus and cinnamon bark. She'd be bathed by silent hands, her skin rubbed until it glowed, her hair combed through with ivory picks scented with oud. The act was methodical, but it was not about purification. It was preparation for gaze, for judgment, for worship, because every inch of her body would soon be examined, if not by eyes, then by memory. She was a queen not of land but of perception, and she ruled that kingdom with fear. There are records, though fragmented and censored, of the psychological weight Cleopatra carried. Plutarch hinted at her intense solitude in public life. Roman commentators, cloaked in disdain, described her as ever-changing, ever elusive, ever alone. Theirs were not compliments. They sensed something in her that unsettled them, that her silence was louder than their laws, that her scent outlasted their speeches. But it wasn't power that made her terrifying. It was the way she made herself unknowable. Cleopatra learned early that to be desired was to be seen, and to be seen was to be vulnerable. So she sculpted a new identity each night, in oil, in silence, in unbearable restraint. Those closest to her couldn't tell where her skin ended and the mask began. Even her lovers were chosen. Like policies, each man a tool for leverage, each encounter a test of control. No one ever claimed Cleopatra trembled. No record describes her pleading. That kind of weakness had no place in her arsenal. Instead, she wore a lure like armor, soft to the eye, fatal beneath. Her enemies feared her not because she seduced them, but because they couldn't unsee her after she did. Her presence lingered, clung to their skin, their conscience, their wives' breath. Men confessed to her things they wouldn't say to priests. And yet, it was Cleopatra who bore the heaviest confessions, of loneliness, of futility, of exhaustion masked as ritual. The same sense that melted generals reduced her to exhaustion. There is something tragic in a woman who can no longer sleep without first becoming divine. Even her rest required performance. Her bed linens were perfumed, her hair braided with threads soaked in musk, her pulse slowed only by tinctures administered in secret. Nothing in her life happened without preparation. No touch, no moment, no breath. This chapter of her life is not romantic. It is terrifying. It is the story of a woman who weaponized every inch of herself to survive a world that would sooner destroy her than see her unguarded. And it is the story of what happens when those weapons turn inward, when even your own scent begins to suffocate you. When you cannot enter your chambers without preparing for battle, when the air you breathe is designed to control, not comfort. Cleopatra's inner world was not a place of freedom. It was a chamber of performance, a perfumed prison. Every night she stepped into it willingly. Every night she drowned in its rituals to remain untouchable. But touch, after all, was what she feared most. Because behind the veil of perfume and power was a truth she could never admit, not even to her mirror, that she no longer remembered what she smelled like, only what others needed her to be. And that, more than anything, is what made her dangerous. Because a queen who loses herself becomes impossible to defeat. She becomes myth, and myth cannot die, only decay. Quietly, elegantly, invisibly, the rituals continued. The scents grew heavier, the chambers more silent, and still the world outside kept closing in. The next ritual would not require perfume, it would require disappearance. And the price of seduction would only rise. They waited, men of rank, soldiers, kings summoned at dusk by decree, and then left to sit for hours inside chambers scented with unknown oils and silenced by anticipation. The corridors were dim, the servants mute, and the furniture too delicate to touch. Time stretched and twisted. There were no clocks in the house of Cleopatra. There was only breath, and waiting, and the slow disintegration of resolve. Some never saw her at all. Some glimpsed only a servant delivering a wordless command, "Return tomorrow." The queen was not ready, but this was the plan. Cleopatra had discovered that the sharpest edge of desire was absence, not beauty, not words. Absence. She did not hunt her prey, she lured them to starvation. The architecture of her palace itself obeyed this logic. The outer halls were bright, opulent, open, what foreign guests expected from an Egyptian monarch, but the deeper one walked, the quieter it became. The air thickened. Guards appeared in pairs, then singles, then none, and by the time a guest reached the last threshold, the innermost chamber where her scent hung, but her body did not, the visitor's name, title, and purpose had already begun to dissolve. This was not seduction, it was psychological dismemberment. Identity lost by design. There are records of Roman officials who departed Cleopatra's palace speaking in incomplete phrases, forgetting their mission briefs, forgetting the Latin names of their own legions. Cleopatra needed no blade to disarm a man. She only needed him to believe he was Chosanin, then remind him, without explanation, that he was not, and that perhaps he never had been. The discomfort this bred was unbearable for men raised in empires where presence was power. Cleopatra weaponized absence like arsenic, slow, invisible, fatal. But there was nothing random about her vanishing. It was rehearsed. Her schedule was choreographed to appear fluid, but followed strict internal rituals. Attendants passed coded gestures. Candles were extinguished in timed succession. Doors remained closed just long enough to evoke panic, but never long enough to offend protocol. A man could wait 3 hours and feel honored. He could wait 5 and feel ruined. And when she finally appeared, if she appeared, it was never when he expected. Her silence was more studied than any orator's speech. Plutarch romanticized it. But silence is not passive. Silence can be engineered. Cleopatra's silence was so precise, so total, that men filled it with their own longing, their own guilt, their own confession. In her presence, they confessed not because she asked, but because the absence of questioning created a vacuum of control. Power shifted without motion, and no man left with the upper hand. What does it do to a woman to become this machine of controlled anticipation? What does it cost to make others forget themselves so completely? Cleopatra did not seduce by being someone, she seduced by being anyone, and over time, she became everyone. The rituals demanded she alter her language, her expression, her body, depending on who was summoned. Some nights she was the laughing daughter of the Nile, barefoot and clever. Other nights she was the silent oracle in a veil of myrrh. To one man, she whispered poetry in demotic Greek. To another, she stared wordlessly as he drowned in fear. Every night required a new mask, and no mask could ever be removed. She wrote nothing down, but the women who dressed her, who perfumed her wrists, who painted her lips, left fragments of their terror in the margins of history. They watched their queen disappear every night, not into the arms of men, but into roles so dense with performance that no one knew when the acting stopped. If it stopped, one attendant, later interviewed by Roman scribes, said, "When I look at her, I see many faces, but I no longer know which one she was born with." It is a terrifying thing to forget your own reflection. And yet, she remained in control, or seemed to. Even as the stress fractured her sleep, even as she began repeating herself in private rooms, even as her instructions grew vague and contradictory, she retained the appearance of omnipotence, because the illusion must never falter. If even one lover caught a glimpse of the trembling woman behind the mirage, the empire might notice. and empires do not forgive weakness in women, they crucify it. But the cracks spread. Cleopatra's memory began to fail in small, unspoken ways. One night she addressed a courtier in the wrong dialect and froze mid-sentence. Another evening she repeated the same question 3 times. These were not yet scandals, but in her world, they were disasters. For a woman who ruled through myth, the erosion of performance was fatal. The tragedy was not that she lied to the world. The tragedy was that she had to. Every act of disappearance was a shield, every delay, a mask. She was not born a goddess. She built the illusion from perfume and restraint, and once it was built, she could never leave it. By the time Caesar arrived, she was no longer a queen in a palace. She was a ghost in a fortress of mirrors. They say Cleopatra never needed to raise her voice, but the truth is darker. She no longer remembered how the next chamber would be even quieter, and in it, something sacred would begin to rot. Cleopatra did not simply offer her body, she offered access to the divine. In the temples, in her chambers, in whispered rites, no historian could fully decode. The queen transformed herself into more than flesh. She became interface, oracle, threshold between worlds. She was not touched, she was worshipped, and those who reached for her did so not in lust, but in reverence edged with dread. Egypt had always blurred the line between sexuality and divinity. The gods themselves were born from bodily force, Atum self-generated existence, Isis conceived through magic, Min's eternal erection was carved into temple walls. But Cleopatra took this theology out of myth and turned it into practice. Every evening she was prepared not like a lover but like a vessel. She was stripped, anointed, incanted. Over she inhaled the smoke of blue lotus and mandrake root. She drank infusions thick with poppy wine and herbs her Greek physicians would not name aloud, and then she waited, not for passion, for transformation. But happened next cannot be described as intimacy. It was ritual possession. Partners were selected not for love, but for symbolic function. Senators, priests, generals, each representing a foreign god, a forgotten star, a prophecy fulfilled. They entered not to touch a queen, but to be consumed by a goddess, and they believed it. To lie with Cleopatra was not an act of pleasure. It was submission to power made flesh. The ritual had strict phases: silence, breath, the pressing of oil-slicked palms against hieroglyph-marked skin, the slow breaking down of self. Attendants stood outside the chamber not as guards, but as witnesses. They recited prayers as muffled sounds escaped through scented curtains, sometimes crying, sometimes silence, sometimes incoherent chanting. In the morning, the partners left altered. Some wept, some begged to return, a few would later take their own lives. They said nothing made sense after her. They described visions, omens, dreams of the Nile turning to blood or of stars falling into her eyes. This was not seduction, it was theological conditioning. And Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing, just she learned from the cults of Isis how to harness erotic, from Greek initiates, how to create trance states through rhythm and sound, from Persian healers, how to mix herbs that stimulated devotion, and from years of observation, how to read a man's face the moment he surrendered belief. Because once a man believed, he belonged to her mind, body, soul, but there was a cost. Each night, Cleopatra slipped further from herself. The line between queen and goddess eroded. Her body, once a political tool, became a ceremonial object. She could not be touched casually, she could not weep publicly, she could not eat without ritual, sleep without incense, speak without measured cadence. Spontaneity was no longer permitted. Humanity, increasingly, was forgotten. There is no record of Cleopatra laughing in private. There are texts heavily redacted, awkwardly translated, that suggest she feared the aftereffects of these rites. Nightmares, bleeding, numbness. She began requesting that priest-physicians examine her hands for divine heat, a euphemism, perhaps for nerve damage or hallucinatory sensation. One scroll, found in a Theban cache centuries later, references the queen's shaking, and the fear that her nightly transformation had become irreversible. She didn't just absorb men's belief, she swallowed it, and like any sacred object that takes in too much veneration, she began to crack. The priests who supported her feared what she had become. Worship without limit is indistinguishable from madness. Cleopatra was no longer grounded in her advisors noted that she increasingly consulted oracles for matters of grain trade, demanded omens before speaking to diplomats, refused to travel without dream interpretation. Her body, once the sharpest weapon of Egyptian diplomacy, had become a temple no one could desecrate, including herself. And yet, the rites continued, because they worked. The men returned, the alliances formed, The wars paused. Rome itself hesitated. Even Caesar, the most logical, ruthless tactician of his generation, fell under her spell, leaving his laws to decay while he lay beside her in candle-smoke delusion. When asked why he spent nights in Alexandria, he answered only, "She is not what you think," and then refused to say more. But the darkest moment came when Cleopatra began selecting younger and younger initiates, not lovers, not suitors, symbols, boys anointed in sacred oils and brought before her in silence, perhaps to recreate forgotten myths, perhaps to re-enter her own lost youth, perhaps because the goddess Isis never aged and Cleopatra no longer knew how old she was. The rites had become memory palaces, rehearsals for resurrection. She was not playing a part. She had become the myth, and in doing so had erased the woman underneath the flesh had spoken for too long. The oracle could no longer rest. In the next chapter, the rituals will take a darker turn as the line between seduction and submission collapses into something medicinal, something chemical, something final. Cleopatra will no longer be worshipped through prayer. She will be swallowed through the cup, and the poison will begin. They never drank freely in Cleopatra's presence. They drank carefully, nervously, always from the cup she handed them, and she watched them drink, always, because by the time the wine touched their lips, the outcome was no longer about pleasure. It was about control. Cleopatra's chambers were not merely perfumed. They were calibrated. Each fragrance, each drop of oil on her skin, each cup of wine served behind gold lattice and silk veils, all were measured. The queen did not intoxicate her lovers with love. She intoxicated them with chemistry. Wine was her first weapon, her softest knife. And within it, dissolved in honey and citrus, were infusions crafted by apothecaries who answered only to her. These were not aphrodisiacs, these were thresholds: poppy, mandrake, henbane, blue lotus, each combined to induce arousal, vulnerability, sometimes trance. Some men remembered the nights as dreams, others remembered nothing at all. A few described seizures, visions, moments of collapse. One man claimed he heard the Nile whispering his name as he lay beside her. Another claimed he forgot his native language. Cleopatra did not call these outcomes side effects, she called them signals. Every mixture was recorded, not in scrolls, but in memory. She knew how long it took for a blend to disorient a senator, how many sips silenced a general's suspicion. She adjusted doses by region, by constitution, by perceived guilt. No man was given the same cup twice, because the experiment was always evolving, and Cleopatra was always learning. She was not interested in love. She was studying power under sedation. Her own body became the delivery system, lips glossed with diluted toxins, fingertips perfumed with nerve-softening oils. She brushed against a man's throat and watched the pulse slow. She kissed the edge of a mouth and watched the pupils dilate. Nothing was accidental. Every response was documented not in ink but in internal tables built over years. Her memory was sharper than any ledger, and the cost of forgetfulness, in her world, was death. Even Caesar, even Antony, even men trained in political warfare, none left her rooms with full consciousness. And those who did wake beside her awoke weaker. They spoke slowly, they agreed, two terms they would never have accepted by day. Some begged to return, some never did, but not by choice. There are whispers in Roman archives of sudden illnesses, unexplained disappearances, diplomats who returned from Egypt with trembling limbs and cloudy speech. Rome feared Cleopatra not just for her beauty, but for her unpredictability. And Rome's men feared waking up changed, not in love, but in allegiance. But this wasn't just chemical warfare, it was emotional engineering. Cleopatra wanted to see how far belief could be manipulated with biology. She wanted to know what happened when a man believed he had fallen in love, not through free will, but through a tincture he could never identify. The question was never whether he desired her. The question was, would he remember why? But this level of control demanded sacrifice, not from them, from her. Cleopatra drank what they drank, not in full, not in equal strength, but enough to test immunity. She exposed herself to her own poisons, slowly, repeatedly, over years. She burned her tongue on trace amounts of opium. She stained her gums with herbal resins. She trained her body like a temple or a battlefield, and this transformed her. Lines of her face grew sharper, her sleep shortened. She began to speak more softly, as if preserving breath. Some attendants recorded that she winced when applying her own lip pigment. Others noted she carried salt under her tongue to counter sudden dizziness. There were nights when she whispered to herself between gestures, not prayers, but formulas. She wasn't acting, she was calculating. By this stage, Cleopatra no longer seduced. She administered. Seduction was no longer art, it was pharmacology, and she was no longer a lover. She was a scientist with no lab but her own skin, and no subjects but those who thought they'd conquered her. But the body, no matter how trained, remembers violation. Even when self-inflicted. She began to lose balance unexpectedly. She forgot names mid-conversation, her hands shook when pouring wine just briefly, just once, and when no one watched, her mirror revealed signs she couldn't correct with ointment, tension in her jaw, hollowness around the eyes, a tremor at the edge of her lips. The poison had always been meant for others, but it had begun its slow return home. Still, she continued, because by now she had no choice. The mythology of her control depended on consistency, and consistency required pain. To falter even once meant to be seen, and Cleopatra had built her rule upon being unknowable. So she painted her eyes thicker, she scented her body deeper, she drank more slowly, she laughed less, and she watched each man who drank from her hands as if studying a flame about to vanish. In public, she remained untouchable. In private, she began to wonder if she still knew the difference between the ritual and herself. She had once used perfume as armor, now she used poison as language. But the next stage would demand even more, not just from her lovers, but from her memory. Because when seduction becomes medicine, and medicine becomes ritual, the only thing left is surrender, and the next mirror she faced wouldn't show her strength, it would reflect the price of obsession, and it would crack, quietly, permanently. The mirror no longer flattered her, it interrogated. Each night, Cleopatra sat before its polished face, searching for something beneath the gold dust and pigment. Something that might prove she still existed beyond her performance. But the woman, staring back, had become unfamiliar to perfect, to still, to silent, to be real. The rituals of beauty had once been tools, gold flakes to catch candlelight, kohl to shape the eyes into a divine gaze, pearl powder to signal luxury, control, and invincibility. But now, there were compulsions. Even when no one would see her, she applied them. Even when no court was assembled, she powdered her cheeks. The motions no longer served diplomacy, they served dread, the fear that if she skipped even one stroke of eyeliner, the illusion would fail, and everything else would fall with it. Her attendants whispered among themselves. They spoke of her stillness, of how long she lingered at her dressing table, sometimes mouthing words they could not hear. One claimed she had seen the queen begin to paint one eye, then stop and start over 6 times in a row. Another said she had walked in to find Cleopatra already made up, then watched in silence as the queen stripped it all away and began again. What began as ornament had become obsession. There was no joy in the colors anymore, only ritual repetition, only war paint worn for an enemy that never appeared except inside. The mirror. Her enemies beyond the palace were growing bolder. Rome was no longer sending diplomats, it was sending threats. The provinces were shifting under her feet, her alliances frayed, and in the stillness of her chamber she could feel the future clawing at the walls. But the mirror never showed panic. The mirror lied, or perhaps it revealed something crueler, that the mask she painted had begun to outlive the woman beneath. She no longer trusted her face. It changed without her command. The angles seemed sharper, then hollow. The eyes widened, then shrank. Some nights her mouth looked foreign. She would press fingers to her cheeks, trying to remember what it felt like to be seen without powder, without script, without strategy. But there was no memory, only paint, only layers. There are unspoken horrors in a woman forgetting her own reflection. It is a grief you name, the mourning of presence, the terror of fading while still breathing. Cleopatra had ruled through beauty, but not through passivity. Her appearance had been part of her arsenal. Now it was a prison. Her cosmetics grew heavier as her influence slipped. She began layering kohl darker than tradition allowed. Her lip pigments deepened to unnatural reds. Her perfumes were no longer floral, but sharp, alchemical, heavy with resins and smoke. The air around her changed. It was no longer seductive, it was oppressive, and still she painted. Even when her skin cracked beneath the paste, even when her hands trembled, even when she had no audience. This wasn't vanity. This was survival through illusion. The Greek physician-philosopher Dioscorides, who served near her court, once noted in a private scroll that Cleopatra had developed a form of waking dream in which she cannot recall whether her reflection moves with her or against her. Others dismissed it as poetic metaphor, but her attendants knew. She had begun speaking to the mirror, not rehearsing, conversing, confessing. Cleopatra had always been 10 women to 10 men, but now she was a stranger to herself. She feared the unpainted version of her face might speak back with honesty, might tell her the crown meant nothing, that the rituals had become meaningless, that Rome would take everything no matter how perfect her eyes looked. So she painted harder. She rejected food if it smudged her lipstick. She avoided water that might lift the powder from her neck. She began sleeping upright so her face would not crease against the pillow. This was not confidence, it was collapse. A performance with no applause, no audience, and no exit. Behind every cosmetic was a question she could not silence. Do I still matter if I am no longer desired? She had once captivated the world by refusing to chase it. Now she feared its eyes turning elsewhere. She feared irrelevance more than invasion. She feared aging more than enemies. Because Cleopatra knew her power did not come from gold or armies, it came from being unforgettable. And the mirror had begun to forget her. Her lovers no longer arrived on their knees. They arrived on orders. Her seductions had turned diplomatic, calculated, cold, and so she changed her face again, not to please them, but to control them. Her features grew severe, her expressions stylized. She wore new faces like masks. For Caesar, one mask; for Antony, another. But behind all of them, the woman remained unseen, even to herself. One night, after hours at the mirror, she whispered a sentence overheard by a servant. The words were recorded only once, in a marginal note scribbled into a linen inventory scroll by a frightened hand. If I wash it all off, I'll disappear. The queen feared being forgotten, but more than that, she feared discovering there was nothing left to remember, that the next chamber would offer no mirror, only foreign eyes, and to meet them she would create a face none had ever seen before, not even her own. She had seduced pharaohs, she had been worshipped as Isis. But when Rome came, Cleopatra did not meet it as a queen, she met it as a symbol, something crafted, something artificial, something foreign to her own soul. With Caesar, she became legend, the veiled goddess arriving in a carpet, the perfect synthesis of spectacle and submission. He saw not a monarch, but an idea, a living emblem of conquered mystery. She played the part to perfection, softened her Greek into melodic cadence, what the Roman silks laced with Egyptian script, quoted Homer beside hieroglyphs. In her presence, Caesar felt himself a god reborn, and that illusion served her kingdom for a while. But performance is a form of erosion, and Cleopatra performed without pause. She studied Roman law to flatter senators, memorized their myths to echo their vanity. Her temples welcomed Roman envoys with Latin inscriptions. Her coins bore Romanized features. Her public feasts served Roman wine. And when Antony arrived, hungering not just for alliance but intoxication, she gave him something even more dangerous, reflection. She became everything he thought he wanted. A queen who bowed like a concubine, then rose like a goddess. A woman who quoted Virgil before undressing. A seductress who turned ritual into theater. But the tragedy lay in what she erased to create these illusions. She stopped invoking Egyptian gods by name. She avoided the temple of Hathor. Her prayers were shortened. Her perfume changed. Her accent flattened. Even her titles were altered to echo Roman cadence. No longer daughter of Ra, now simply Queen of Kings. At first, the transformation was strategic, a mask worn with intent, but over time the mask hardened, became habit, became default. The woman who once ruled Egypt as living divinity now struggled to speak without calculating the cultural expectations of her listener. She no longer knew how to be still. Attendants noticed changes. She began requesting translations for sacred texts she had once recited from memory. She paused before pronouncing Egyptian names. Her gestures became more theatrical, her gaze more deliberate, as if rehearsed. Her laughter lost its natural rhythm. Every response was tuned for foreign ears, and the men, they never noticed. They were too busy staring at the illusion they helped construct. Cleopatra was no longer a person. She was a mirror, a shrine to their fantasy. Caesar saw conquest, wrapped in incense. Antony saw salvation soaked in wine. Neither saw the fracture underneath, but Cleopatra saw it, and she began to fear it, because even gods grow tired of their altars. She began to resent the softness in her voice when she addressed Roman officers. She grew impatient with their inability to pronounce Egyptian words. She flinched, in private, when Antony referred to her as his Roma, and when she caught herself smiling for his approval. She stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the wall, whispering old prayers in a tongue she no longer trusted. Identity, once divided, cannot be easily restored. She could not return to herself, because she no longer remembered where the line had been drawn. Every room required a different mask. Every man, a different mythology. Even her children, part Greek, part Roman, part Egyptian, had become symbols she could no longer fully explain. She had become a stranger in her own temple, and the rituals stopped working. What once disarmed now rang hollow. The incense no longer inspired reverence. The dancers no longer stirred awe. The wine dulled faster. Her words landed with less impact. Her mirror offered only silence, and the men changed, too. Antony grew jealous, impatient, unpredictable. Rome whispered of betrayal, and Cleopatra, once the architect of desire, now performed her roles with mechanical precision. Stripped of joy, she no longer played goddess. She reenacted her own myth as a duty. One night, an attendant found her pacing, fully robed, hours before dawn. Her eyes were swollen. She asked no one in particular, "How many names must I wear before I forget the one I was born with?" There was no answer, because the only answer left was consequence. When the final embassy from Rome arrived, demanding her surrender, demanding her sons, demanding that she come unpainted, and unveiled something in her snapped, the mask could no longer hold, and so she reached for the only thing sharper than her performance. She reached for the dagger, not to kill, yet, but to remember, to feel something real pressed against her skin. A blade did not ask for accent, it did not require ritual, it did not care for Rome or Egypt or Caesar's ghost. It only cut, and in that edge, she found something she hadn't felt in years: truth. She held it for hours, unmoving. When attendants finally entered, she told them nothing. But from that day forward, her performances grew quieter, her gestures fewer, her perfume simpler. The woman who had once turned herself into a dozen goddesses now began subtracting, because the last face she would wear would be her own, and it would bleed. There was no applause for the final act, only dust, silence, and the slow suffocation of power that once turned empires toward her. By her last nights, Cleopatra no longer performed for kings, she performed for ghosts. The walls of her palace still held the scent of myrrh, but no one followed it. The same oils once dabbed onto her collarbones now clung to the empty air, unbreathed. Her servants moved quietly, spoke less, and kept their eyes down, not from reverence but from fear, because the woman they once prepared for gods now spoke. To shadows she bathed with compulsive intensity, washing as if something lived beneath her skin. Her hair, once a symbol of divine order, was plaited and unplaited with trembling hands. Her lips repainted, even as they cracked. Antony was gone, in all the ways that mattered. His love had curdled into noise, his body had grown cold in her arms. Rome no longer approached her in negotiation, it advanced like a predator. They had stopped pretending, and yet Cleopatra still lit the candles, still arranged the silks, still rehearsed the old incantations, as if scent and memory could barricade her from the siege outside her door. But rituals lose meaning when no one believes them, especially the one performing them. She began speaking in half-phrases, lines from hymns interrupted by coughing. She'd start an invocation and forget the ending. Her mirror, once her stage, was now veiled in cloth, not to protect it from dust, but to protect herself from recognition. The painted face it reflected no longer reassured her, it accused. The goddess she had constructed had begun to rot. Cleopatra, the woman, had become the thing left behind, and no one came to save her. Her allies had scattered, her children hidden, the Egyptian priesthood silent. Even the walls betrayed her, their painted hieroglyphs cracking with the pressure of time. She, who once stirred gods and generals, was now confined to a chamber stripped of witnesses, her throne untouched, her name unspoken, and the empire she had built with perfume, seduction, and myth now burned slowly under the weight of history's indifference. The final visitors brought no diplomacy. They came to inventory what would remain. Roman emissaries stood in her halls, not with respect, but with amusement. Her grandeur to them was theater, feminine delusion cloaked in incense. One officer wrote of her draped in false power, refusing to surrender even as the world ignored her. He did not see madness. He saw irrelevance, but irrelevance is its own kind of horror. And Cleopatra had made empires weep with a glance, felt it tightening around her like silk drawn over the throat. So she returned to the only thing she could still control, the ritual. She ordered the chamber prepared as before, the perfumes mixed, the pillows arranged, her garments laid out. But this time, there was no guest, no lover, no diplomat. The performance was not for anyone else. It was for herself. The script was unchanged, the gestures perfect. And still, it meant nothing, because even gods are powerless in empty temples. That night, she sat on the bed she had once adorned with laughter, surrounded by cosmetics that no longer concealed, and wine that had long turned bitter. She touched the dagger only once before placing it beside her as if it were a final lover. It needed no words. It did not lie. It would not flee in that stillness. She whispered no names. Not Caesar, not Antony, not Isis. She spoke only to the space around her, the empty air where her empire used to listen. Some say she wept, others say she smiled, but no one knows. Because by the time the guards entered, the queen was gone. Not disappeared, not stolen, not conquered, gone. What remained was ritual with no soul. A room with no breath, a body perfumed, powdered, positioned but absent. Not just in death, in identity, in essence. Cleopatra had not died as a queen. She had not died as a woman. She had died as a myth unwound. And yet, the irony persists. History remembers her, not kindly, not fully, but obsessively. The Romans who mocked her ensured she would never be forgotten. The emperors who buried her story beneath shame also engraved her into time. She became eternal, not through the seductions she mastered, but through the fears she provoked. She had made herself unforgettable, and the dagger ensured she would never be seen fading. The final ritual was not an act of vanity. It was not the collapse of a seductress. It was the scream of a woman erasing the silence around her before it consumed her whole. And in that silence, she found her last powered escape.